was 2010, and I was a freshman in college. I was going to school in New England, the farthest away from home I had ever been, and I was pretty nervous to be somewhere completely new. All my life I had lived in the same small town, on the same quiet street, in the same exact house. My school had gone from 4th to 12th grade, so I'd had the same group of friends for most of my formative years. Not one of them had gone to the same college as me, though, so going away felt a bit like starting over. To be completely honest, I was a bit scared. Things were easy enough at first, though. My classes turned out to be pretty good, and I even made some new friends in my first few months. Down the hall in my dorm were some guys who were always having jam sessions, and I played a little guitar, so they started inviting me. We'd have a few beers and groove every Thursday night. I felt like I was actually getting acclimated fairly quickly. Maybe everything was going to be okay. Sometime in the early winter, I was sitting in my art history class when I noticed a slight pain in my lower stomach. Nothing too intense, maybe I had just eaten something bad at the dining hall. I forgot about it until later that day when I had to walk across campus for my next class. The campus was on a pretty steep hill, and each step I took up the incline made the pain worse. It was still in my lower stomach, but now a bit sharper. By the time I got to class, I was starting to become legitimately concerned. I met up with my friends at the dining hall that night, but didn't mention anything about the pain. The next morning I felt even worse. I thought a hot shower might help soothe the tension, but when I stepped in the tub I almost doubled over in pain. The pain was now more defined, and specifically in my lower left abdomen. I walked back across campus to the school nurse, where they ordered me a taxi to the hospital. The doctor there determined right away that I did indeed have appendicitis. He told me that it was a very severe case, and that if I had come to the hospital much later, my appendix could have burst. I was scheduled for surgery later that day. To get me to the procedure, someone from the hospital had to wheel me over to a different building. It was freezing cold outside, and so they took me a different way, through the basement of the building I was in and via an underground tunnel. Lying down flat on the gurney, it was hard to see exactly where we were going, but something about our route unnerved me. Have you ever seen that movie, Jacob's Ladder? Remember that scene where they're wheeling Tim Robbins through the hospital and it starts to become more and more hellish? That scene played in the back of my mind as the orderly guided me through the halls deep in the bowels of the building. Suddenly, we went by a room with an open door. I caught a glimpse inside and my blood ran cold. It was a simple room, much like the one they had put me in. Seated upright in a hospital bed across from the door was a man whose face was wrapped completely in gauze. I say completely, but I should say not quite completely. Peering out from beneath the layers of white were two piercing blue eyes looking right at me. We made eye contact for less than a second before he disappeared behind the door frame, the gurney still gliding through the eerie sterility of the fluorescent hallway. The surgery went fine. I stayed at the hospital for a night or two afterwards and then went back to my dorm. I was left with two scars, one right under my belly button and another a little lower and to the left. Just as lasting, though, was that residual image of the man in the hospital bed, wrapped up in gauze. He must have been a burn victim. I found myself thinking about him sometimes, those piercing blue eyes. The image was almost burned into my memory. One night, maybe a week or two later, I was staying up late studying for a test. After the surgery, sitting at my desk was pretty uncomfortable, so I found myself doing a lot of work in bed. I had missed an important lecture during my stay at the hospital and was doing my best to get caught up and prepare. With a textbook open in my lap and a binder of notes still in my hands, I fell asleep on my bed. The next thing I remember was waking up in my bed and being unable to move. My room was dark, except for the tiny bedside lamp I'd had on while trying to study. I had been pretty sore after the surgery, and so at first I thought this was some sort of side effect of my recovery. I tried to sit up, but I was frozen in place, just like I was back on the gurney, wheeling down that tunnel. Then I saw it, across the room over by my closet, a figure, pacing back and forth. I strained to see in the darkness. The figure seemed to be holding his head in his hands. His shoulders were bouncing up and down, and was he crying? I'd say I was paralyzed with fear, but I was already paralyzed. I tried to scream, but I couldn't make a sound, not even a whimper. The figure stopped, lowering his hands and turning towards me. Now lit by the glow of my lamp, I saw his face. Or rather, I didn't. Layers of gauze encircled his head, and from between them, two piercing blue eyes glowed like the embers of a dying fire. My blood ran cold once more, and I could swear my heart stopped. The man from the hospital was in my room. I sprung up from my bed, screaming. I backed into the corner and covered my eyes. A knock at the door. One of my floormates was calling my name. "Hey, you okay in there?" I opened my eyes. The figure was gone. Timidly, I went to answer the door, checking the corners as I did. It was my friend Katie. "I heard screaming," she said. "You okay?" Fine, yeah, sorry. Just a nightmare." I doubt she believed me. Hell, I wasn't even sure if I believed myself. It had felt so real. Anyway, Katie asked if I wanted to come to the weekly jam session, and I declined. I still had to study after all. I went up to the common area in our building and spent the rest of the night at a well-lit desk. I had never had sleep paralysis before, and I've never had it since. But to this day, when I drift off to sleep, I still imagine those piercing blue eyes watching me through layers of gauze. Another spooky one. Have you ever had an episode of sleep paralysis? Do feel free to leave a comment below. Perhaps it's time you get going, but do come by and see me again here at Aberfoyle Manor. I'll have another scary story ready for us.